Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, howdy, ni hao ma. I'm Dr. Brian David Phillips and welcome to DiviniSex. This month's webinar is on sensual ecstatic trance experience as metaphysical practice for meaningful worship. We're going to move into the metaphysical line of use of ecstatic trance. It should be a good one. Okay. Now, some folks will come in late. They often do. A few folks have figured out that I do try to record these, and most of the recordings seem to be okay, so they'll catch the replay. That means they don't get to ask questions. Well, they can ask questions, but it'll be to a recording, and it'll be completely and totally useless for them. So much for them. All right, now, DiviniSex, or the nature of DiviniSex, is we're going to look in terms of a number of things related to sensual, ecstatic trance experience and meaningful worship. I have an outline of things that we do want to go through. I just heard my phone, so I have to turn that off. If you were trying to send me a message while I'm recording, this is what I'm doing. I'm turning off the ringer, so I'm not going to hear that. I won't check my phone until afterward. Sorry. I know some folks have issues getting in, or a whole lot of folks miss the time because they don't really check that time and date link I include on every webinar description. That'll give you the time and date at your location. Because when I post 10 o'clock on Sunday, 10 in the morning, I'm posting Taiwan time. Now, why would I do that? That's a strange thing and seems awfully specific. That's because I live in Taiwan, and so I post my local time. But I do have links so that folks all over the world can get the information. Now, the nature of DiviniSex is the ecstatic trance in a sensual worship context. Now, before you go all creepy on me and think, that seems awfully creepy. Well, it does seem creepy to some people if their belief system doesn't allow for this sort of practice. What I'm going to talk about mostly, though, applies to most faiths or most religious applications. So it's okay if it doesn't fit your specific faith. You can adapt some of the concepts and some of the ideas to your own practice. All right, and that's kind of important because you want to be able to use this stuff, how to work it in. Now, okay, a couple folks, I cheated. I went and checked. You can comment if you're watching. You can comment on the YouTube page, the live page, DiviniSex Live. If you just write a comment, just as you would on any YouTube channel, it should show up in my comment tracker. All right. Now, if you're watching to see what comments are happening, want to be able to use, you may have issues if you're reviewing or refreshing your screen. I recommend not doing that. Just hopefully your comments are coming through. Okay. We've got a couple folks who are having issues with the system. We always have issues with the system. I haven't found the perfect solution for the webinars. The Hangout seems to be a really good solution because it streams live through YouTube, and if our recording doesn't come out, at least we'll have a poor copy archive, because YouTube and Google Plus, they do record these automatically. Yay. I don't like the quality, at least for my location. It's not very good. And so what I typically do is I'm talking to this camera right here, but I'm recording in this one here. And so I've got a much better one, which hopefully will come out. All right, so let's get to her a little bit better. I do have a comment tracker on. If it works, and it has worked on all of the previous Hangout presentations we've done, it has worked. It does stall a bit. It does have a lag, so I'm sorry for that, but we'll get to her. We normally, or not normally, we haven't used it in a long time, we used to use TinyChat for these webinars, but in the last 6-7 months, my TinyChat hasn't worked well at all. In fact, I've messaged them several times, but support on TinyChat is, well, it's not that it's bad, it's just, it seems to be non-existent, at least in terms of the issues that I'm having. And I know for some folks their browsers were broken when it comes to TinyChat, and so we're moving away from that, and it's very, very likely that we will just stick with the Hangouts, Google Plus, and YouTube. It seems to work okay. It does mean that I have to change how I handle certain aspects of the webinars and things like that, but yeah, that's okay. It means more people get to see it. Yay. Alrighty, so let's get to her. Divinisx is inviting in a direct experience of the divine in a sensual manner. Now, some folks, their religious beliefs don't connect the divine to sensuality. And yet we see, even in those sorts of religious experiences, we see folks having what seems to be an obvious sensual experience. All right. For instance, Pentecostals and Neo-Pentecostals are an offshoot of the Pentecostal movement, except they're more progressive rather than incredibly conservative, some of them. But if you're unfamiliar with Pentecostal experiences, they tend to. It's a Protestant denomination. Actually, it's not a denomination in and of itself. There's different denominations that are Pentecostal, but they are a Protestant offshoot, and they tend to have, not tend to, it's the whole experience, they have ecstatic trance experiences. They would never call it an ecstatic trance. They call it a direct connection with the divine and the use of the spiritual gifts. These are the folks who speak in tongues. These are the folks who have faith healing. These are the laying on of hands. These are the folks who have the fire of the Holy Spirit enters people. But when you watch those experiences, either live, as I've been fortunate enough to witness, or just go to YouTube and type in Pentecostals, you'll see that many people have what could be described as a sensual experience. I was just watching, 2 nights ago, I was watching a wonderful documentary. Well, not really a documentary, it was a course on Pentecostal gifts. And when the pastor touched people, okay, he didn't even touch them physically. What he does is he'll say, "Power of the Lord. Power of the Lord," and without physically touching them, okay, he gets about to this close, as soon as his hand comes in, they could feel that spiritual energy, and you can see their entire body light up with positive emotion. Now, some folks experience orgasmic, well, they essentially have spiritual orgasms, because they're connected to the divine in that way. There's nothing wrong with that. They may not describe it that way, but if you're familiar with orgasms, you know that's one. Particularly if you're familiar with hypnotic orgasms, you recognize this is what's happening. Or in my metaphysical or psychic hypnosis set, and my exotic hypnosis induction set, there's a little process I have called positive emotional overload. That's what we're talking about. It's an ecstatic state, except for divinity sex, we channel that specifically and purposefully into a sensual experience. Now, we're going to look at how we can use ecstatic trance and experiential hypnosis in order to create that kind of sensual, ecstatic state, guided metaphysical experience for ourselves and for others. And there are essentially 6 steps to this sort of approach. Please understand when we're talking about metaphysical practice, even though most folks watching this, most folks attending are trained or professional hypnotists, or at least well informed about hypnosis, there are a lot of overlaps here. But most folks who actually practice this stuff as a genuine metaphysical tool, they would never describe it as hypnotic. Keep in mind that many of them, they use a formal induction. Mike McConnell's Pentecostal courses, apostolic courses on activating the spirit, you can see very clearly what his induction is, and he teaches a very clear technique for activating the spirit. And as a hypnotist, I recognize that as an induction, but certainly he would never describe it as a hypnotic induction or even as a trance induction. He describes it as activating the spirit. And that's okay. However, as hypnotists, we can see common underlying operators to these techniques and to these methods. Now, when we have metaphysical exploration within the use of ecstatic, erotic states as worship practice, we need to be very respectful of folks. Now, some folks are very closed about their religious beliefs and their religious practice, and that's okay. Others less so. And I real quick want to make a shout out. Kyle, thank you thank you for your kind comment on my pendant. I love this. It is the Queen of Heaven, and I posted about it on Facebook. It's from Dryad Designs, and it's absolutely awesome. I love it. That's why I wear it a lot. Nathan, I also see your test comments, so you guys are in, and your comments are working. So back to this. Now, there are contexts for erotic hypnosis and ecstatic trance as a personal connection to the divine. Obviously, someone needs to feel a need for that. If you are a religious practitioner, I don't recommend using this kind of stuff with folks who are not prepared for it or who are not if they're not prepared, if they're just not ready for this type of experience, you don't go throwing in on them. Just as with erotic hypnosis, you certainly would just throw in on folks non-consensually. You get consent through context, of course, and through approach. There are methods that we might use for persons who are of multiple religions, just like I've already talked a little bit about Pentecostal practice and how their practice coincides a great deal with some other practices. Now, see, I live in Taiwan, and there are many types of divine ecstatic experience. And so I've seen, when I lived in America, and actually even living in Taiwan, I can watch YouTube and see what's happening on other parts of the planet. I teach a course in trance dance, for instance, and there are many cultures that have different variations of ecstatic trance through dance. You have the whirling dervishes. In Taiwan, you've got folks wearing the mask. But the type of divine ecstatic experiences can be divided into a number of different types or contexts. One might be an emotional connection, and that is an emotional connection with the divine. And when we see the Pentecostal fire, power of the Lord, and I in no way am being denigrating at all. I'm very respectful of this experience. But when we see that experience, that is a positive emotional overload, and so we see an emotional connection with the divine. And that emotional connection can be directed as a sensual experience. It can be undirected sensual experiences too. And I've seen a number of folks who have that fire of the Lord kind of experience who are obviously having a positive emotional state overload, which we can direct as hypnotists. Go to my website, you know the place. If you don't know the place, well, there's a link. There's links, briandavyphillips.net. And I've got courses on this sort of thing, the exotic hypnosis inductions, as well as the ecstatic state engineering course, as well as lots of stuff, okay, where you can direct positive emotional overloads. Others, that positive emotional overload does have a sensuality attached to it. If I'm worshiping, for instance, Ishtar or Aphrodite or Inanna, I may want to have that sensual connection. Another type of divine ecstatic experience is a channeled medium. A channeled medium, that is where one isn't just emotionally touched by the divine, which is the first context, but rather there is a feeling of the divine flowing through one. Folks who do ecstatic laying on of hands, where they allow themselves to feel as if the divine is flowing through them, and when they touch, Qigong isn't specifically a particular divinity, but the idea of flowing energy through someone, or flowing the energy of the Lord. For instance, once more we're going back to Neo-Pentecostal experiences, that's also a form. It can also be channeled in terms of prophecy, where someone's voice comes through. In terms of sensual experience, it's the voice or the feeling of the Spirit or the divine flows through one and out, and there's a connection. You can almost feel it, okay? You can feel like an energy flowing from one. You get that ecstatic state because you're actually a conduit, and so as that divine sensual energy flows through you, you can feel your own body, your mind, and your spirit charge up, but you also feel as if the energy is flowing through. And there it is, okay? And then when you're with someone else who is also experiencing that experience, and so right now I can feel it. It's really awesome. I can feel it, and then if I connect with someone who has that flowing through them at the same time, they're charged, it's almost as if electrons, positrons, quantum physics, all that stuff which has nothing to do with metaphysics, but it has everything to do with metaphysics, and there's a wonderful connection. It's a connection that's at a base level that has some wonderful things. Now this can also be what happens when folks experience certain types of practice, like the Great Rite or the Great Marriage, where it's a channeled experience. You're dissociated, so to speak. So part of you feels as if you are the divine, and part of you feels as if you are just you, and the divine is working through you. And that wonderful dissociative experience can be incredibly powerful. The third context, or third type of divine ecstatic experience, is, of course, straight-out possession, where the human becomes not just a medium or a conduit, but they become essentially an avatar. They become a temporary avatar. Our avatars obviously are not, okay, we're not talking about awesome science fiction films, although I greatly enjoyed that, an avatar. And we're not talking about gaming, but we're talking about an avatar. An avatar is a divine incarnation of, a human incarnation of the divine. Technically, Jesus Christ would be considered an avatar for Yahweh. That is offensive, an offensive statement to some, even though it's pretty much accurate. Vishnu, Krishna, they had avatars. They incarnated into physical bodies. Okay? Now, you become a temporary avatar when you have a possession experience where the deity takes over. If you watch the television series Supernatural, the deity takes over. Angels take over a human body. They're invited in. The angels have to be invited in. And demons just screw you over. But demons also possess. And during the possession, the human identity is set aside, which is sometimes an even more intense dissociation effect, where you're watching your divine self. Other times it's completely associated, as if you feel as if you are the divine. Rather than watching the divine work through you, you feel as if you are the divine. And we're going to look at, I believe it's next month? I'm not sure. Next month is, we're going to look at mythic roles and the work of Joseph Campbell and some things like that. But emotional connections, channeled medium, and possession. Now, most of us are most interested in emotional connections. Some folks are interested in the channeling and possession aspects of divinity sex. But most of us are looking at that positive, sensual, emotional connection. All right. Now, I have an interest. Some of you know me well. Some of you don't know me well, but you at least know this. And some of you don't know me from Adam, or Bob, or James, or Doug, or another Brian. But I have a really strong interest in comparative mythology, comparative religions. And one thing in my years of study and my experience in different countries, different cultures, I've witnessed ecstatic states and connections with the divine. Now, these may or may not be genuine experiences of the divine. That's going to depend upon your belief system. In terms of those of us who are a little more skeptical of such things, we could just pretend that it's psychological. And that doesn't make it wrong. That makes it a powerful experience. Okay? Now, I have met folks who have had these kind of ecstatic states based not on a psychological technique to gain this state. I'm most interested in psychologically engineering ecstatic states. So hypnosis and things like that. Others use general things, okay? And so some folks do indeed liken it to the Force, or the Qigong as the Force. Kyle, you're right. Ayahuasca is an extremely effective method of attaining that divine ecstatic state. And I know folks who have taken ayahuasca. There is a group in Taiwan that experiments, who have difficulty separating their ayahuasca experience from a genuine experience. So I know a wonderful young man who has experienced shape-shifting, another thing I have an interest in. And his shape-shifting through ayahuasca was to become a panther. And he believes he was a genuine panther. For me, shape-shifting is typically you feel as if you're a panther, but you're not a panther. You're still a dude who just feels as if he's a panther. But ayahuasca, psychedelics of many types can gather that. One problem with those is you really need to make sure, well, it's not a problem. It's just highly recommended that you have someone you're working with for those kind of experiences. I've seen folks in Taiwan. I've seen folks who, there's no drugs needed. You can have these experiences, psychedelic experiences, without drugs. And ecstatic experiences are often without drugs. When we look at prehistory and early history, we can see that different religions and different cultures developed different religions. Many of them used psychedelic or psychostatic, psychologically ecstatic states, psychostatic states, as part of the religious practice. Okay, the hero's journey in terms of the vision quest, things like that. And many of these cultures use drugs to set that up. We don't need to use drugs, and as hypnotists, we understand that. Okay, there are things you can do to engage a person so that they have this experience without the needing of the drug catalyst. Nothing against the drugs. I'm actually very much for legalization of certain psychedelic substances, but I don't need it. Just as I don't need to drink to get drunk. I'm a hypnotist. And of course, in terms of cultures with religious setups, there are things that they do. Of course, there are the ecstatic postures. Anthropologists who have looked at postures that seem to be common throughout cultures and history, that seem to engender trance states, experiential psychedelic, ecstatic states. For instance, looking up. Okay, when we pray, we look up to the crucifix, or in Taiwan, we would kneel and we would look up to the idol in the temple. Okay, looking up tends to enhance one's ability to enter into experiential trance. Okay, those of you who know, and I know many of the folks who are watching right now are familiar with the work of Herbert Spiegel, or at least you know that I rant on in very positive ways about Herbert Spiegel, and he found that an easy test for hypnotizability is what we now call the Spiegel eye roll. Okay, and he named it that way first, as well he should. But essentially, you ask someone to look up. Okay, and I'll get a little closer, but you're not going to see as clearly. But if I look up as high as I can, and then as I'm looking up, comfortably looking up as high as you can, comfortably, slowly close the eyes. And then relax. Okay, I open the eyes. Now I'm going to describe what happened. I have no idea. I wasn't watching myself. Oh, who would have thunk it? But what happens in the Spiegel eye test is there's a moment as you start closing your eyes where it's kind of record skips, and you check to see how much white is there. Okay? Now, when I did it, was it mostly white or mostly iris? Some folks, when you ask them to roll their eyes up, that's about as high as they go. According to Spiegel, those folks tend to be non-hypnotizable. I disagree with his terminology and his conclusions, but I absolutely agree with him on the statement that those who have very little iris showing or are all white tend to be incredibly hypnotizable. Now, those folks also tend to be very excellent candidates for ecstatic states in metaphysical or religious contexts. Okay, and so religions all over the planet, or spiritual practices, shamanism, animism, they have a tendency to have a sacred posture of the person being low and the idol or the divine, the representation of the divine, higher, so that we're looking up. When we pray, we tend to look up. Now that posture itself, while Spiegel used it as a test for hypnotizability, they would I'm getting distracted. I'm trying to read. Yeah, they tend to also, not just as an indicator of hypnotizability, but that posture also helps someone go into ecstatic states or trance. Now, unlike Spiegel, I don't think this is a lifelong characteristic. His son David has found some, what he believes to be some genetic writers, that genetically there are certain genes that show a predisposition for this ability. And he just says, so, you're either hypnotizable or you're not, period. I disagree. I do find that for most folks, hypnotizability is not just an attribute, it's also a skill. And so you may have the attribute that allows you to do it more quickly and more easily, but through practice you can learn to do more. Okay? Now, the thing about ecstatic states in terms of psychesthetic, it's less reliable to get everyone there than drugs, but it's more reliable in guiding the experience. If you take LSD, a psychedelic substance, I mean a manufactured one, but albeit it's still there. You take LSD, you could have an incredibly powerful, wonderful, positive experience, but you could also have a bad trip. And it's very important that if you're doing that, that you have someone who can talk you through a bad experience. You can actually guide someone so you can increase the likelihood of a positive experience, but bad trips still happen. With ecstatic states, psychostatic states, or psychologically engineered ecstatic states, you're less likely to have that come up. And because it's a much more active kind of thing. Oh, sure, can still happen. One of the mass shooting perpetrators in the United States, folks were very surprised that he meditated a lot. He meditated, and when he meditated, he locked himself into a recursive loop of negative experiences and negative feelings. If you're depressed, you probably want some positive guidance when you're using experiential trance to help yourself. Because if you get into that recursive negative loop, you're just rebuilding and reinforcing bad things. Here in Taiwan, I've seen ecstatic experiences in terms of temples. Two types of experiences. In Taiwan, we had this experience where, for instance, not just this, but for instance, the Matsu Festival, all of the temples for Matsu, the goddess of the sea, they put an idol representation of the goddess from their own temples onto a chair that is then has two poles, and then someone in the front, someone in the back, and they bring this goddess to the big temple in Beigang, where it's energized with the major goddess idol. All right, and the guys who are carrying it, they become energized and channel the goddess herself. And so you'll see it almost looks as if they're drunk. Sometimes at temples you'll see a priest who becomes drunk with the spirit, and he's moving around. And that they apprentice young men to learn how to do this sort of thing. And this kind of experience is an ecstatic experience. It can be channeled into a completely positive overload, but it can also be channeled for some very interesting things in terms of sensuality. When some parades for the gods, if you see a local parade in Chinatown, if you're in the U.S. or elsewhere where they exist, some countries don't have, they have large Chinese populations, but they don't have Chinatowns. The United States, Chinatowns developed because of inherent racism when the Chinese first immigrated, but that's another topic for another discussion. But when you see a parade in Asia or elsewhere, a Chinese religious festival, you'll see some folks wear these huge masks. I mean, they're huge. And those folks, they tend to walk in an interesting way. It's incredibly sweaty, but when they're wearing the mask, they become the God. They become the deity. It's very interesting. The Hopi, of course, have a similar experience. They put on the mask and they become the divine, or they become the spirit. You put on a coyote mask, you become coyote. Some folks, they role play. It's engaged role play when they do these sort of things. Those of you experienced with interactive drama or free-forming or multi-forming or LARPing, live action role-playing, are aware of some types of role-play theory at the moment, which is an engaged imagination where you become your character and you set it aside. But this kind of engaged role-play can become an ecstatic experience as well. Okay, now, another type of ecstatic state, which is directly related to the sensual experience, of course, is the Great Rite. Some of you are familiar with the Great Rite as the sacred marriage, for instance, the sacred marriage of some Wiccan beliefs or those kind of experiences, or the Great Rite of a good example of that. There's a retelling of the Gilgamesh story, in which Gilgamesh becomes the god, and he meets with the high priestess, who becomes the goddess Inanna, and Gilgamesh, as the god, mates or has sex with the priestess of Inanna. They feel as if the deity is moving through them. The great marriage, of course, the high priest and the high priestess do this sort of thing. Now, when we see folks, well, okay, maybe you don't see folks doing it, but when I've seen folks performing this ritual, they are typically role-playing. They're typically saying the ritualistic lines, and then they do the coitus, and it's very, how to describe this, when I've seen it happen, it's usually without passion, without sensuality. It's very, you have erections and lubrications, but there's nothing to it, because it becomes a form of role play or ritualistic role play. Ideally, to really enhance that sort of experience, you have an active or engaged role play where you become the role, and part of that is our emotional connection or our channeling medium or even full-blown ecstatic possession of the experience. Now, in engaged role play versus ecstatic experience, it might be a little easier for some folks to think of it in terms of active prayer versus passive, unengaged prayer. When someone is practicing a religious belief, or they're practicing their faith, most religions we're aware of, most have a form of prayer. Okay, and I've talked about this before in other contexts, that some folks, when they pray, they're just going through the motion, they're going through the ritual. And the ritual can be nice, and the ritual can be valuable, but it doesn't have the same value as the folks who have active prayer. Active prayer or engaged prayer is when you imaginatively intensify the experience so that you feel a connection and the divine flows through you. It's not just talking at the gods, it's talking through the gods with the gods. There's a wonderful quote or expression by Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker was one of the founders of the American Native Church, okay, American Indian Church, okay, and geez, my brain, she walks so good today. The Native American church. Okay, Quanah, who happens to be my great-great-grandfather, he had this saying, okay, and that was that he said that the white man goes into church and speaks to God. The Indian goes into the sweat lodge and speaks with God. And to me, that's it. That's active prayer versus passive prayer. If you're just speaking to God, okay, you're just you're talking at someone. You're not really in a conversation. Now, when Quanah Parker discusses the Native American church experience, he's discussing it in terms of a becoming the God. He's also talking in terms of an ecstatic state that's engineered by two things. One, peyote, and two, extreme duress. The sweat lodge, because it's an intense physical experience, creates an ecstatic state. You have to be very careful if you're doing that kind of extreme work. People can pass away. A couple of years ago, that happened in the United States, of someone having a sweat lodge workshop, and they didn't really pay attention, and a few folks passed away because it was just too intense. All right. Parker also used peyote, and peyote is a sacrament in the Native American church rituals. Okay? But we can gain that through other forms of ecstatic states, forms of ecstatic state induction. Okay, but keep in mind the difference. Sex magic uses this kind of ecstatic experience in order to channel. It's a little different because they're channeling the erotic experience for their work, their great work, but it can be reverse engineered for other aspects. Tantric experience, folks who do tantric sex, well, okay, folks, some folks who do some forms of tantric sex do this kind of thing. Nathan has an excellent example of another form of ecstatic becoming, or divinisex, or not divinisex, but divine incarnation, or type 3 of the types of ecstatic experience, and that is that a Roman triumph where a victorious general gets to be Jupiter for a day, and you become not unlike Mardi Gras, where the fool becomes the king for a day, and you have an interesting carnivalesque twist to things. Now, that's all well and good, Dr. Phillips, but how do I do this? Well, one, just hypnotize someone and say, boom. Okay, but you don't need to. As I said, we don't have to have a formal induction for this sort of thing. Go watch some Pentecostal services, whether you agree with their faith or not. Watch the service in terms of how ecstatic states are used through the worship and how it enhances the experience for the parishioners, which I think is a very beautiful thing. But there are essentially 6 stages, okay? And now when I do this later, I'll pop it up. But expectancy, engagement, experiential trance, intensified imaginative involvement, divine flow of 1 or 2 types, and ecstatic transcendence. Now let's take a look at these steps or stages of the divinisex, or actually any divinistatic experience, any ecstatic experience in a metaphysical or worship experience. Specifically, we're most interested today in the sensual experiences. expectancy. Okay? Now, expectancy means you need to expect something to happen. If you're familiar with Robert Cialdini's work on influence, you know the law of expectancy. Okay? And essentially, hypnotic operators tell us that hypnosis or experiential trance or ecstatic experience is more likely to occur when we build expectancy. The person genuinely expects something to happen. If you go to someone who doesn't believe in deity and you tell them, when I put my hands on you, or you don't tell them, you just think to yourself, I'm going to put my hands on you and that person's going to experience the Lord. Ho, ho, ho. They're less likely to. Even Jesus expected people to have faith. Faith is a form of expectancy. You expect something to happen. You believe something to happen. So you need to build expectancy either in yourself for the experience or in the persons you are working with. Obviously, if you have a religious group who really believes in what's going, the faith, and this is a form of religious worship that they are used to, they're much more likely to have expectancy. And so pop that in there. Get expectancy. What's the next step? Well, that would be engagement. Okay, get engagement. And that is you get the person to do something. They have to be active in the experience, not passive. You don't just walk up to someone even though they expect something to happen and lay hands on them or fill them with the power of the Lord. They have to be engaged. They have to be actively visualizing, actively following your directions with the expectancy. Once you have that, then we get experiential trance or somnambulism or hypnosis or whatever. That's the experiential set. Once we get that, and you can do that through breathing. Each breath in, feel the power of the Lord. Each breath in, feel the goddess loving you. Each breath in, feel your genitals becoming more and more aroused with the power of the divine. Actively engaged experiential trance. Breathing is wonderful. Breathing is one of the absolutely best ways of switching someone over into experiential trance. But it's not just breathing. It's that engagement aspect. And of course, part of my definition of experiential trance is, of course, intensified imaginative involvement, which essentially is your imagination has to be engaged and you intensify. So you're not just imagining that something might happen, you're imagining as if it's happening now. So you know what it feels like to feel joy. So feel joy. Imagine as if you feel that. So if you are expecting the feeling of passion or pleasure cascading through you from the Lord, is that you bring that in, intensify it through the imagination. Building expectancy, Kyle, you're absolutely right, is the beautiful side of confirmation bias. And remember, we're talking about metaphysical aspects. We're talking about placebo. We're talking about ecstatic states. This confirmation bias isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. You expect it to happen, so it happens. And you feel as if it's happening. Intensify that imaginative involvement. Once you've got that, with your experiential trance, we have what I call divine flow. And I divide divine flow into two separate types. One is channeled emotional experience, and the other is mythic identity. Channeled emotional experience, of course, is that positive emotional state, that pleasure, that joy, that rapture, that what I call it in my exotic hypnosis inductions, or ecstatic engineering ecstatic state set, is the ability to overload the system with pleasure, with joy, with passion. And so that's channeled emotional experience. You feel it as if the divine is flowing through you in the experience. Now you do have to be active in the experience. Okay, either yourself when you're doing self-hypnotic experience, or when you're working with others. You've got to get that active participation in the experience. Kyle says this is a weakness some folks have. It's something that you've got to work on. And of course, if you're using it in metaphysical context, most folks in that kind of context are okay with it. Although not always. I do teach every few years. I teach Bible and literature at the university. And unlike some of the teachers, some students, they take the course. It used to be about 5% of the population of Taiwan was Christian, but now it's down to about 3%. But if you're studying in an English department where I teach, you really do need to know about, to understand Western literature, you have to know about the Bible. Well, some folks, when they see Bible and literature, they assume it's going to be like Bible class. So I get a lot of Christians who take the course, and very few who aren't Christian. But sometimes, and they get disappointed. Actually, one of the chairs once told one of my Christian grad students that if you want your faith challenged, take Brian's Bible and Literature course. Now, I don't go out of my way to challenge people's faith. No. It's just sometimes I talk about things that are fact that kind of throw folks off. I just recently did a lecture about the song by the Rivers of Babylon, and upset some folks when I said that it has a line about crushing the skulls of babies with rocks. So that's not in there. Well, actually, yeah. If you read the psalm, instead of listening to the song, it's there. It's a very incredibly creepy, but it is there. But every once in a while, a student will tell me that they were looking for a new church and they were invited to a Pentecostal church. There's a lot of them. Pentecostalism is the fastest growing form of Christianity on the planet. In the United States, just like most Christianity in the United States, it's petered off. Christianity is not growing, it's shrinking. In Europe, it shrank much faster, but it's still the fastest growing form all over the planet. It's actually the fastest growing religion on the planet right now. And so there are some Pentecostal churches here in Taipei and elsewhere in Taiwan, and sometimes these kids go and they have no idea what to expect because they didn't grow up hearing about Shakers and things like that, or they didn't study it, and so my class is the first time they're exposed to it. And so when they go in, they're not ready for the experience. They see people speaking in tongues and having the fire of the Lord on them. They don't know what to do. Speaking in tongues, by the way, when I talk about engaged role play, some folks, I talked about the Great Marriage, and some folks have no passion for it. When they're performing a sexual act and there's no passion, it's just wooden. It's like, how can you do that? I don't understand. But some folks who speak in tongues, they're actually told, if they don't feel it, so just say anything. It's okay. You'll get it. Fake it till you make it, kind of. But some folks, if you watch them on TV, you can absolutely tell they're not in an ecstatic state. They're just making crap up. They go, "Asamakala kosaboma," and it's not an ecstatic state. It's not a genuine pouring of the divine or pouring of the unconscious. It's just someone consciously doing this thing to fool others, unfortunately. But there are folks who have a genuine experience and work on that engaged ecstatic experience, that active ecstatic experience. And once you've got that divine flow, it's either a channeled emotional experience or it's a mythic deep trance identification. Mythic deep trance identification, which essentially is the divine becomes you. You become the divine, whether through an erotic or sensual aspect or some other. Once you've got that divine flow starts coming in, you then get ecstatic transcendence. And ecstatic transcendence is essentially you're no longer dissociated. You're completely associated in the experience, and it just flows through you completely. You transcend. You transcend yourself. You transcend the experience, and you experience a beautiful ecstatic state. Now, obviously, today, I talked about Divinisect, but obviously what I've talked about can apply to many other contexts. My own personal belief system, my own personal practice relies heavily upon ecstatic states. The trance is the thing for me. Now, for you, it may be something else, and certainly my trance is not your trance, but we can learn the steps together and have a personal experience of our own. I hope you have found today's talk useful, and I hope that you continue to find these webinars or sermonations almost useful and helpful in your own understanding and your own practice. Please, if you are not familiar with my YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button. Subscribe. Well, just hit it once and comment on our videos. Subscribe to it. On Tuesdays, I have a series of hypno news and rants. Either I present something from the news about experiential trance and things like that, or I just go off and rant. Wednesday is question time, and so ask me your questions. I'll tell you no lie. Okay, I may lie, but if I do so, it'll be a good lie. Mostly though, if you ask me something, I'll try to respond as clearly and as frankly as possible. Thursdays, I've been doing trance time, which is essentially I guide folks through a trance experience. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and I want to thank you for coming. Thank you for your coming. That's a Taiwan thing, but thanks for coming, and I hope it's been helpful. Please give us positive feedback. Let us know that these webinars or the videos we've been doing have been helpful or useful or entertaining to you. And let us know what you would like me to do a talk about. Because I want you to come in many different ways, meanings of that word. I want you to come now. No, really, I do want you to come. And the best way for me to make sure you're coming to these experiences, particularly the live experience, is to present material and concepts that are your interest, that you'd like to know about or experience. So give me some feedback. If you don't have any feedback, just say, "You're awesome, dude." And most importantly, I really would like to just say thank you. Thank you. And this has been Dr. Brian David Phillips, and I'd like to say live trance and prosper. Bye-bye.